I gave my last pair of warm boots to a stranger on a frozen park bench, and that same night, my daughter-in-law laughed and told me I was nothing but a burden. I remember how the cold felt that morning, sharp and unforgiving, the kind that seeps through your coat no matter how tightly you wrap it around yourself. The park was nearly empty, just a few scattered figures moving quickly, heads down, trying to outrun the wind. I wasn't in a hurry. At 68, I had learned that rushing rarely changed anything. My name is Helen Carter, and until recently, I believed that if you gave kindness to the world, it would find its way back to you. That morning, I wasn't thinking about philosophy or fairness. I was thinking about how quiet the house had felt before I left, how the sound of my own footsteps echoed in a place that no longer felt like mine. I had been living with my son Jason and his wife Lily for almost a year, ever since my husband passed. Jason insisted it was the right thing to do. Lily never said it, but I could feel how much space I took up just by existing. When I saw him on that bench, the man looked like part of the winter itself, still and gray, his shoulders hunched against the cold. His shoes, if you could call them that, were thin, worn down to something that barely stood between his feet and the frozen ground. I slowed without really deciding to. Up close, I noticed his hands, steady but pale, and his eyes, clear in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "You're going to lose your toes out here," I said, half to myself. He gave a small smile, the kind that doesn't ask for pity. "I've lost worse," he replied. There was something about his voice, calm, measured, that made me pause. I sat down beside him, the bench biting through my coat, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried the faint sound of traffic, distant and indifferent. I looked down at my boots, thick, lined, the only thing keeping me comfortable that morning. Then I thought about how easily comfort can be taken for granted, how quickly it disappears. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached down and began to pull them off. "These will help. More than they help me," I said, placing them gently beside him. He didn't move right away. He just looked at me, really looked, as if trying to understand something deeper than the gesture itself. "Kindness always comes back," he said quietly. I smiled, though I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. "We'll see," I answered, slipping my feet back into the cold, feeling the shock of it run through me. I stood up, nodded once, and walked away before I could change my mind. By the time I reached home, my toes were numb, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the door. The warmth inside didn't feel welcoming. It never did. I barely had time to set my bag down before Lily's voice cut through the silence. "Did you seriously go out in this weather again?" she asked, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. Her eyes dropped to my feet, and her expression shifted into something sharper. "Where are your boots?" I hesitated, just for a second. "I gave them to someone who needed them more," I said. There was a beat of silence, and then she laughed, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. "Of course you did," she said, shaking her head. "You give everything away like it matters, like it changes anything. You don't even have anything left to give." Jason didn't look up from his phone. He didn't say a word. I stood there, the cold from outside still clinging to me, and realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The park had been freezing, but at least out there, I hadn't felt invisible. I did not respond to Lily that night, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I had learned that words spoken in the wrong room only echo back as something weaker. Instead, I walked quietly to the small guest room at the end of the hallway, the one that used to be Jason's office before I moved in. The bed was neatly made, the walls bare except for a single framed photo of my husband and me taken years ago at a county fair, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and pressed my hands together, trying to warm them, though the chill that lingered in my bones had very little to do with the weather outside. That house had central heating, double-pane windows, and every modern comfort money could provide, yet somehow it always felt colder than that park bench. The next morning, I woke early out of habit. I moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to make noise, brewing a pot of coffee the way I always had, even though Lily preferred her expensive machine that hissed and beeped like it belonged in a laboratory. I poured myself a cup and stood by the window, watching the pale light spread across the street. For a moment, everything looked peaceful, almost normal, as if the tension from the night before had been nothing more than a passing shadow. But then I heard footsteps behind me. "You should really stop going out like that," Lily said. her voice already carrying that familiar edge. I turned slightly, offering a small nod. Fresh air helps me think, I replied. She let out a soft, dismissive laugh and opened the refrigerator. What you should be thinking about is how to make yourself useful around here, she said, not even looking at me. Utilities are not free, you know. The words landed heavier than they should have, not because they were new, but because they were becoming more direct, less disguised. I set my cup down carefully, afraid that if I held it any tighter, my hands might betray me. I try not to be in the way, I said quietly. She closed the refrigerator door and finally turned to face me, her expression calm but sharp. That is exactly the problem, Helen. You think not being in the way is enough. It is not. Jason walked in just then, adjusting his tie, his attention already somewhere else. Morning, he said, glancing between us, but not staying long enough to read the room. Morning, I replied, forcing a small smile. Lily said nothing more, but the silence she left behind said enough. After they both left for the day, the house settled into its usual stillness. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and folded a basket of laundry that I knew no one would thank me for. These small tasks had become my way of justifying my presence, of convincing myself that I still belonged somewhere, even if it was only in the quiet spaces between their routines. Around noon, I found myself thinking about the man on the bench again. There had been something about him that did not fit the picture I had assumed at first glance. It was not just the way he spoke, but the way he carried himself, even in stillness. People who had nothing usually carried that weight in their posture, in the way their eyes avoided yours. But his had not. His eyes had been steady, observant, almost as if he were the one noticing me rather than the other way around. I shook the thought away, telling myself I was reading too much into a simple moment. After all, I had only given away a pair of boots. It was not a grand gesture, not something that should linger in my mind like it did. And yet, as the afternoon stretched on, I could not shake the quiet echo of his words. Kindness always comes back. I looked down at my bare feet, wrapped now in thick socks, and let out a small breath. I had spent most of my life believing that if you gave enough, cared enough, endured enough, it would all balance out in the end. But standing there in that quiet house, surrounded by things that were not mine, I began to wonder if I had misunderstood something fundamental. Maybe kindness did come back. Maybe it just did not always return from the places you expected. That evening, the three of us sat at the dining table, and for a moment, it almost looked like a normal family dinner if you did not listen too closely to what was being said or what was not being said at all. The table was set neatly, the plates aligned, the silverware placed exactly where it belonged, but the air between us felt uneven, like something invisible had shifted just enough to make everything uncomfortable. I had cooked, as I often did, a simple meal that I knew Jason liked, roasted chicken with vegetables and warm bread, the kind of dinner that used to bring conversation and laughter when my husband was still alive. Now, the only sound was the soft clink of utensils against ceramic and the occasional notification from Jason's phone lighting up beside his plate. Lily took a small bite, then set her fork down with a deliberate motion, her eyes flicking toward me in a way that made it clear she had something to say and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. I was thinking today, she began, her tone casual but too precise to be accidental, about how some people confuse kindness with responsibility. I kept my gaze on my plate, cutting a piece of chicken slowly, giving her the space she clearly intended to fill. Jason did not look up. What do you mean? I asked, my voice steady. Lily leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her arms in a way that felt more like a statement than a gesture of comfort. I mean, she continued, there is a difference between helping someone and making reckless decisions that affect everyone else. I knew exactly where this was going, but I let her continue, because sometimes people reveal more than they intend when they think they are explaining something simple. Like giving away something you actually need, she added, her eyes dropping briefly to my feet, now covered in plain house slippers. It is not generous. It is irresponsible. Jason shifted slightly, finally glancing up, but his expression remained neutral, distant, as if he were observing a conversation that did not involve him. She was just trying to help someone, he said quietly, though there was no conviction behind the words. Lily turned to him with a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And who is helping us, Jason? She asked. Because last time I checked, we are the ones paying for everything here. The word everything hung in the air longer than it should have. I set my fork down, folding my hands in my lap to keep them still. I did not realize my presence was such a burden, I said softly. Lily let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. It is not about realizing, Helen. It is about being honest. You act like what you do out there matters more than what happens in this house. I looked at her then, really looked, noticing the certainty in her expression, the way she spoke as if she had already decided what kind of person I was. Sometimes, I replied slowly, what happens outside reminds us of who we are inside. She shook her head, dismissing the thought before it had a chance to settle. That sounds nice, but it does not pay bills. And it does not make you valuable here. The word valuable struck something deeper than I expected, not because it was new, but because it was finally said out loud. Jason cleared his throat, pushing his plate slightly away. Let us not make this a bigger deal than it is, he said, though his voice carried the quiet urgency of someone who wanted the conversation to end without choosing a side. Lily leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. It is already a bigger deal, Jason. We just have not been saying it. I felt the weight of their words settle around me, not loud or explosive, but steady and undeniable, like the cold that lingers long after you come inside. For a moment, I thought about explaining, about telling them what I had seen in that man's eyes, about the way the world had felt a little less indifferent in that brief exchange. But I knew it would not matter here. So instead, I picked up my glass of water, took a small sip, and let the silence return. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the only space where truth can breathe without being dismissed. The house grew quieter after that dinner, but it was not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that pressed in on you, reminding you of every word that had been said and every word that had not. I washed the dishes slowly that night, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary, as if I could rinse away the feeling that had settled in my chest. Behind me, I could hear Lily moving around the living room, the soft hum of the television filling the space where conversation used to exist. Jason had already retreated to his office, the door closing with a gentle click that somehow felt final. When I finished, I dried my hands carefully and stood there for a moment, staring at the reflection of the kitchen light on the countertop. It occurred to me then that I had spent years trying to be useful in ways that could be measured, meals cooked, rooms cleaned, schedules remembered, thinking that if I did enough, I would always have a place. But standing there, I realized that usefulness, at least in this house, had very little to do with effort and everything to do with perception. The next morning, I decided to go back to the park. Not because I expected to see the man again, but because something about that moment had stayed with me in a way I could not explain. The air was just as cold, the sky pale and stretched thin across the horizon, and the same bench sat there, quiet and still as if nothing had ever happened. I walked toward it slowly, my steps careful on the frozen ground, my breath visible in the air. This time, I wore an older pair of shoes, not nearly as warm, but enough to get me there and back. When I reached the bench, I paused, looking at the place where he had been sitting, trying to recall every detail I might have missed. The way he had spoken, the way he had looked at me, the strange calm in his voice. It did not feel like an ordinary encounter, and yet I could not explain why. I sat down, pulling my coat tighter around me, and let the silence settle again. Minutes passed, then more, the kind of time that stretches when you are not expecting anything, but still hoping for something. A few people walked by, bundled up, eyes forward, each carrying their own thoughts and concerns. No one stopped. No one noticed. After a while, I stood up, brushing a thin layer of frost from the bench, ready to leave. That was when I saw it. Tucked near the edge of the bench, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of snow, was a small object, something that had not been there before. I bent down carefully, my fingers brushing away the frost, and picked it up. It was a card, thick and simple, not flashy or decorative, but deliberate. For a moment, I just held it, turning it slightly in my hand, as if expecting it to explain itself without being read. My heart did something unexpected then, a small, quiet shift that I could not quite name. I looked around, half expecting to see him somewhere nearby, watching, but the park remained unchanged, indifferent. Slowly, I turned the card over. There was no long message, no elaborate explanation, just a name and a number, printed clearly, confidently, as if whoever left it never doubted it would be found. I stared at it longer than I meant to. The cold air forgotten for a moment as a different kind of realization began to form. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a feeling that something had moved, just slightly, beneath the surface of everything I thought I understood. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, pressing it flat against the fabric, and for the first time in a long while, the cold did not feel quite as heavy. I did not tell anyone about the card when I got home. I slipped off my coat, hung it carefully by the door, and moved through the house as if nothing had changed, even though something inside me had shifted in a way I could not yet explain. The card rested in my pocket for most of the afternoon, a quiet weight that I was aware of with every step, every movement, as if it carried more than just a name and a number. I waited until the house was empty again before taking it out, sitting at the small desk in my room where the light fell softly across the surface. For a moment, I just looked at it, tracing the edges with my fingers, noticing how deliberate everything about it felt. There was no decoration, no unnecessary detail, just a clean, confident presentation that suggested whoever owned it did not need to prove anything to anyone. I read the name once, then again, letting it settle in my mind. Edward Hayes. It sounded familiar in a distant way, like something I had heard in passing but never paid attention to. Beneath it was a number, simple and direct, without any explanation. I set the card down and leaned back slightly, considering what it meant to even think about calling it. It felt unreasonable, almost intrusive, as if I would be stepping into something that did not belong to me. And yet, he had left it there, in a place where I would find it, with no one else around. That could not have been accidental. I thought about his voice, calm and steady despite the cold, and the way he had looked at me, not with gratitude alone, but with something else, something measured and intentional. Kindness always comes back. The words returned to me, quieter now, but no less persistent. I let out a small breath and reached for my phone, holding it for a moment. Without unlocking it, there was a part of me that wanted to put it all aside, to pretend that the moment in the park had been just that, a moment, nothing more. It would have been easier, simpler. But something about the way my life had been unfolding lately made me realize that doing nothing was also a choice, and not always the right one. Slowly, I dialed the number, each digit feeling more significant than it should have. I held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, then twice, the sound steady and clear in the quiet room. By the third ring, I almost convinced myself to hang up, to retreat back into the familiar silence of my routine. Then the line clicked. "This is Edward Hayes," the voice said, the same calm tone I remembered, now clearer, more defined without the wind and distance between us. For a second, I did not speak. It was not doubt that stopped me, but the realization that whatever this was, it was real. "This is Helen," I said finally, my voice steady but softer than usual. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long enough to be uncomfortable, but long enough to feel intentional. "I was hoping you would call," he replied. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. Hoping. Not expecting, not assuming, but hoping. It was a small distinction, but it mattered. "I found your card," I said, as if that needed to be explained. "I thought you might," he answered, and there was something in his voice then, a quiet certainty that made me sit a little straighter. "I would like to thank you properly," he continued. "Not just for the boots, but for what it meant." I hesitated, glancing toward the closed door of my room, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "You already said thank you," I replied gently. He gave a soft breath that almost sounded like a faint laugh. "Some things deserve more than words," he said. The room felt different then, not warmer exactly, but less heavy, as if the air had shifted just enough to make space for something new. I looked down at the card still resting on the desk, then back at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like someone waiting to be acknowledged. I felt like someone being invited. We agreed to meet 2 days later, not in the park, but at a small cafe just a few blocks away, the kind of place that does not draw attention, but somehow feels intentional in its quiet. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I have always preferred to gather myself before stepping into something uncertain. The air inside was warm, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the scent of fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the cold that had defined our first meeting. I chose a table near the window, where I could see the street and the slow movement of people passing by, each one wrapped in their own lives, unaware of how a single moment could shift everything. When he walked in, I recognized him immediately, though everything about him looked different. He was dressed simply but well, his posture straight, his presence unmistakably composed. There was no trace of the man who had sat quietly on that bench, and yet, somehow, it was still him. He saw me, gave a small nod, and walked over with the same calm certainty I remembered. "Helen," he said, as if my name had always belonged in his voice. "Edward," I replied, standing briefly before sitting again. For a moment, neither of us spoke, not out of discomfort, but because there was something unspoken that did not need to be rushed. He sat across from me, folding his hands lightly on the table, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "I wanted to meet you like this," he said after a moment, "so you could see me as I am, not as a situation." I considered that, the way he chose his words, the way nothing about him felt accidental. "And how are you?" I asked, not as a formality, but because I genuinely wanted to know. He allowed a faint smile. "I am a man who has spent most of his life surrounded by people, and yet, very few who saw me clearly," he said. "That day, you did not ask who I was. You simply acted." I looked down briefly at my hands, resting in my lap. "It did not feel like much," I admitted. "It felt like exactly what it needed to be," he replied. The waitress came by then, taking our orders, her tone polite but casual, unaware that the man sitting across from me carried a presence that extended far beyond this small space. When she left, Edward reached into his jacket and placed something on the table between us. It was not an envelope or anything formal, just a simple folded paper. I did not touch it immediately. "What is this?" I asked. "An opportunity," he said. I looked up at him, waiting. "I run several foundations," he continued, his tone still calm, almost understated. "Most of them focus on large-scale initiatives. But I have learned that the most meaningful impact often begins with individuals who understand something others overlook." I felt a quiet shift in my chest, not excitement, but recognition. "I am not sure I understand," I said. He nodded slightly, as if he expected that. "I would like you to help me," he said. "Not as a favor, but as a partner. I want to create something smaller, more personal, a way to help people who are often unseen, the way you saw me." I glanced at the folded paper, then back at him. "Why me?" I asked, the question simple but necessary. He held my gaze, his expression steady. "Because you acted without expecting anything in return," he said. "That is rare, and it cannot be taught." The cafe around us continued as if nothing unusual was happening, cups clinking, voices blending into a soft background. But at that table, something had changed in a way that felt both unexpected and completely natural. I reached out then, finally touching the paper, feeling the slight texture beneath my fingers. For a long time, I had been trying to prove my value in a place that measured it in ways I could not meet. Sitting there, across from a man who saw something in me without needing explanation, I realized that value does not disappear. It simply waits to be recognized in the right place. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt exactly the same as I had left it, but I did not. I placed my coat on the hook, set my bag down gently, and walked through the living room where the television was on, but no one was watching it. The familiar arrangement of furniture, the polished surfaces, the carefully chosen decorations all remained unchanged, yet something about it no longer held the same weight over me. I moved more slowly, not out of hesitation, but because for the first time in a long while, I was not trying to fit myself into the rhythm of that space. I was simply moving through it. Lily was in the kitchen when I stepped in, her phone in one hand, her expression focused on something beyond the room. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes scanning me in a way that felt more observant than usual. "You were out longer than usual," she said, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. I set my gloves on the counter, smoothing them out instinctively. "I had something to take care of," I replied. She tilted her head slightly, studying me for a moment as if trying to detect what had changed. "You seem different," she said, not accusing, but not entirely comfortable either. I met her gaze calmly. "Do I?" I asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she turned back to her phone, though her attention was no longer fully there. "Well," she said after a pause, Just do not forget what your responsibilities are here. The words were familiar, but they no longer settled the same way. Before, they would have lingered, echoing quietly in my mind long after they were spoken. Now, they felt distant, like something that belonged to a version of me that had already begun to fade. Jason came home shortly after, his usual routine unchanged, brief greeting, distracted movements, his attention divided between work and whatever else occupied his thoughts. At dinner, the conversation remained light, surface level, as if the tension from previous nights had been carefully set aside but not resolved. I listened, nodded when appropriate, and spoke when spoken to, but I did not feel the need to fill the silence anymore. There was a difference between being quiet because you felt small and being quiet because you no longer needed to prove your place. Later that evening, in the privacy of my room, I unfolded the paper Edward had given me. The details were clear, structured, outlining a role that was both simple and significant. It was not about managing large operations or making complex decisions. It was about observing, understanding, and identifying the kinds of needs that often go unnoticed. It was about people who, like me, had learned to exist quietly in spaces where they were no longer seen. I read it slowly, letting each line settle, not rushing to accept or reject it, but allowing myself to fully understand what was being offered. For years, my sense of worth had been tied to how well I could maintain a home, support a family, and meet expectations that were rarely spoken but always present. This was different. This was not about fitting into something that already existed. It was about helping to create something new. I set the paper down and leaned back, looking at the ceiling, feeling a calm I had not experienced in a long time. It was not excitement, not yet, but it was the absence of something heavier, the constant weight of trying to belong where I was no longer wanted. The next morning, as I prepared my usual cup of coffee, I noticed the way the light came through the window, softer than before, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. Lily entered the kitchen again, her movements precise, controlled. She glanced at me, then at the table, then back at me, as if something about the scene did not match her expectations. "You are up early," she said. "I always am," I replied. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then asked, "Are you going out again today?" I met her eyes, not defensively, not cautiously, just directly. "Yes," I said. She held my gaze a moment longer than usual, then nodded slowly, as if trying to process something she could not quite define. "Just make sure you are back before dinner," she added. I did not answer right away. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle before speaking. "We will see," I said quietly. It was a small response, simple and unremarkable on the surface, but it was the first time I had not immediately adjusted myself to fit within the boundaries she had drawn. And somehow, that small shift felt larger than anything I had done in a very long time. The next few days unfolded in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, not because anything dramatic had happened yet, but because something inside me had finally stopped waiting for permission to exist. I began leaving the house more often, not with excuses or explanations, but with a quiet certainty that I did not owe anyone a detailed account of where I was going or why. Each morning, I dressed carefully, choosing simple clothes that made me feel like myself again, not just someone trying to blend into the background of another person's life. The first time Edward introduced me to his team, I noticed the way people listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. They asked questions, thoughtful ones, and they waited for my answers as if what I said held weight. It had been a long time since I had experienced that. We visited small community centers, spoke with individuals who had been overlooked in ways that felt painfully familiar, and I began to understand what Edward meant when he said impact could begin quietly. It was not about grand gestures or recognition. It was about seeing what others had stopped noticing. Meanwhile, at home, the change did not go entirely unnoticed. Lily watched me more closely now, her eyes lingering a moment longer each time I walked through the door. One evening, as I set my bag down, she crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, her expression controlled but clearly unsettled. "You have been going out a lot lately," she said. "More than usual." I nodded calmly, removing my coat. "I have," I replied. She waited, as if expecting more, but when I did not offer an explanation, her tone sharpened slightly. "Doing what exactly?" she asked. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Something meaningful," I said. The words were simple, but they carried a steadiness that even I had not heard in my own voice before. She let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Meaningful does not pay bills, she said. Meaningful does not keep this house running. I considered her words for a moment, not dismissing them, but no longer accepting them as the only truth. There are many kinds of value, I said quietly. She shook her head, clearly unconvinced, but something in her expression suggested that her certainty was no longer as solid as it had been before. Jason, on the other hand, remained distant, though I noticed small changes in the way he looked at me, brief moments where his attention lingered just long enough to suggest he was noticing something he did not fully understand. One afternoon, as I prepared to leave, he stopped me near the door. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "what is going on?" It was the first time he had asked me anything with genuine curiosity in a long while. I paused, considering how to answer without turning it into something defensive or complicated. "I am finding my place again," I said simply. He frowned slightly, as if trying to make sense of that. "Here?" he asked. I held his gaze, calm and steady. "Not just here," I replied. He did not respond right away, but I could see the question lingering in his mind long after I stepped out the door. That evening, something shifted more visibly. Lily had been on her phone for most of the night, her attention sharper, her posture more alert than usual. At dinner, she barely touched her food, her eyes flicking between Jason and me as if she were waiting for something to reveal itself. Finally, she set her phone down and looked directly at me. "I saw something today," she said. Her tone was controlled, but there was an undercurrent of tension beneath it. I remained still, giving her space to continue. "A picture," she added, "from some event. You were there." I did not react immediately. I said calmly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you know who else was there?" she asked. I held her gaze, steady and unshaken. "Yes," I replied. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice dropping. "Edward Hayes," she said, as if the name itself carried weight she had only just begun to understand. The room fell quiet in a way that felt different from before, not heavy with dismissal, but charged with something else, something that had not been there until now. I reached for my glass of water, taking a small, measured sip before setting it back down. "Yes," I said again, my voice even. And for the first time since I had moved into that house, I watched as certainty shifted, not in me, but in the people who had once been so sure of where I belonged. The silence that followed her words did not feel like the kind that pressed down on me anymore. It felt like something shifting outward, like the room itself had adjusted to a truth that could no longer be ignored. Lily leaned back slowly, her eyes fixed on me as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one she had dismissed for months and the one now sitting across from her with a calm she could not control. Jason looked between us, confusion written clearly across his face, but beneath it, there was something else, something closer to realization. "You know him?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. I nodded once. "I do," I replied. Lily let out a short breath, shaking her head as if rejecting the idea before it could fully settle. "That does not make sense," she said. "People like him do not just meet people like you in a park." The words might have stung before, but now they felt more revealing than hurtful. I rested my hands lightly on the table, not defensive, not withdrawn, just present. "Sometimes they do," I said. She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "And what exactly does that mean?" she asked. I met her gaze steadily, holding it without tension. "It means I gave him something when he needed it," I said. And he remembered. Jason sat back in his chair, his attention now fully on me. "What did you give him?" he asked. I glanced down briefly at my hands, then back up. "A pair of boots," I answered simply. Lily blinked, clearly caught off guard by the simplicity of it. "That is it," she said. "You expect me to believe that someone like Edward Hayes would care about something like that?" I allowed a small pause before responding, not to create drama, but to let the moment settle into its own weight. "It was not about the boots," I said quietly. "It was about being seen." The room grew still again, but this time, it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that had been building quietly beneath every interaction we had shared. Lily's expression shifted, not into understanding, but into something more uncertain, as if the ground she had been standing on was no longer as stable as she believed. "So what is this now?" she asked. "You are working with him?" There was a slight hesitation in her voice, the first crack in the certainty she had carried for so long. I am helping him with something, I said. Jason leaned forward slightly, his brows drawn together. What kind of something, he asked. I considered the question, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to give it in a way that did not diminish its meaning. The kind that reminds people they still matter, I said. Lily let out a quiet laugh, but it lacked the sharpness it once had. And that is supposed to change anything? She asked. I looked at her then, not with defiance, but with a calm clarity that surprised even me. It already has, I replied. The words did not need to be louder. They did not need to be repeated. They simply existed, and that was enough. Jason lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up at me, something in his expression softening in a way I had not seen in a long time. Mom, he said, more carefully now, why did you not tell us? I held his gaze, steady but not accusing. Because you were not asking, I said. The answer settled between us, quiet but undeniable. Lily shifted in her seat, her posture no longer as rigid, her certainty replaced by something closer to calculation, as if she were trying to understand how to reposition herself in a situation she no longer controlled. Well, she said after a moment, smoothing her hands over the table, if this is important, then maybe we should all be more involved. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I reached for my glass, taking a small sip before setting it back down. Then I looked at her, not unkindly, but without the need to soften what I was about to say. Not everything is meant for everyone, I said gently. The words were simple, but they carried a boundary I had never set before. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it was not uncomfortable. It was clear, and for the first time since I had walked into that house as someone trying to belong, I understood something with complete certainty. I had never been the burden they believed I was. I had simply been in the wrong place, waiting for value to be recognized where it never would be. And now, I was no longer waiting. A quiet act of kindness on a freezing morning changes everything for an elderly mother who has long been treated as invisible in her own home. After giving away her only pair of warm boots to a stranger, she returns to a house where the daughter-in-law sees her as a burden and the son remains distant, reflecting a painful reality often explored in family stories. But what begins as a simple moment in the cold slowly unfolds into a powerful journey of dignity, recognition, and emotional transformation as the elderly mother discovers that the stranger she helped was not who he seemed, opening the door to a new purpose that challenges the limits placed on her by her own family. As the daughter-in-law's dismissive attitude begins to crack under the weight of unexpected truth, the balance of power shifts in a way that reveals deeper themes of respect, value, and self-worth, making this one of those unforgettable family stories where quiet strength speaks louder than confrontation. Through subtle emotional tension, layered character development, and a deeply relatable perspective, the narrative explores how being overlooked can shape identity, and how a single act of compassion can rewrite that narrative entirely, a hallmark of compelling family stories that resonate across generations. The elderly mother's journey from silence to self-recognition unfolds naturally as she steps into a new role beyond the limitations imposed by her household, while the daughter-in-law is forced to confront her own assumptions about value and control, adding another layer to the emotional depth often seen in impactful family stories. This story captures the contrast between cold indifference at home and unexpected warmth from a stranger, building a powerful emotional arc that highlights the importance of being seen and respected, a recurring theme in the most meaningful family stories. As the truth emerges and relationships are quietly redefined, the elderly mother no longer seeks validation from those who dismissed her, instead embodying a calm authority that transforms the dynamic around her, reinforcing why audiences are drawn to authentic and emotionally grounded family stories. With its steady pacing, realistic dialogue, and deeply human perspective, this narrative stands as a compelling example of how small moments can lead to profound change, delivering a satisfying emotional payoff that defines the essence of powerful family stories. Character 1. Elderly, white woman, age 68. Wearing simple winter coat and modest clothes. Front-facing view. Natural lighting. Realistic human skin texture. Calm, strong expression. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Subtle wrinkles. Silver hair, neatly styled. Authentic American setting. Character 2. White woman, age 35. Sharp facial features, confident expression. Wearing modern, elegant indoor outfit. Front-facing view. Natural lighting. Realistic human skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Styled hair, minimal makeup. Subtle cold demeanor.